Hi, Jeff. Good morning.
Good morning. Hi, Tom.
Hi. So I'm doing another one of my conversation with friends, although this time my guest, Geoffrey Owen, is much more than a friend. He's also my stepfather. Jeff is a very distinguished former editor of the Financial Times. He's also a distinguished academic from LSE, and he was also a leading tennis player who played with some of the best players in the world in Wimbledon and also at Flushing Meadows in New York. So, Jeff, before we get on to the journalism and the tennis, let's just start at the beginning. Tell me a little bit about your parents, who they were, where you were born, your upbringing.
Well, I grew up in Wiltshire, which is in south of England, in a with my two parents who were both very sporting inclined. My father was actually an academic. He worked in Burma for most of his life. A tennis playing family. We had a tennis court in the garden where my mother and my father taught me, and so I was active in the tennis world from quite a young age.
Yes, and I should have mentioned before, although it's hardly relevant with a timeless person like yourself, that a couple of months ago you turned 92. So to put into context, you were growing up in the 1930s and 40s, and it's in the 1950s that you played, you developed your tennis career, and indeed started journalism. So. Shall we go straight to tennis, or is there something else about your schooling? You was in the war. Some of when you were upbringing, is there something you remember from that?
Well, I was born in 1934. I was sent to boarding school at the age of 8, 1942, in Oxford. And then after that, I went to a larger boarding school at Rugby in the Midlands, and then to Oxford University.
By the way, for international viewers, Rugby School is where the game of rugby was founded.
That's
Although
right.
your prowess was not, did you play rugby in addition to your tennis and hockey, or not so much?
No, I played rugby as well, so I played all the sports that were available. Maybe
There,
not much cricket, but otherwise I played a lot.
Okay, there we are, rugby at rugby school. So with tennis, although I know you're very modest about this, and this was in the era before tennis grew into a much more professional sport, but as I know from the photos up at your home, you have a photo of you playing the great Australian Ken Rosewall at Wimbledon in, I think it was 1955. He was I think he was number two in the world at the time after the American Tony Trabert. And I recall that in the game against Rosewall, although you lost, it was 6-4, 6-4, 6-1 against Rosewall, who later went on to the semi-final that year and in fact went on to four different Wimbledon finals. So do you remember the atmosphere of playing against one of the world's very best in at Wimbledon?
Well, yes, that was the first time I played at Wimbledon in 1955. I think it was on about court 5 or 6 or so, not one of the big show courts. Obviously, a bigger match altogether was the one I played in 1958 when I played the eventual winner, Ashley Cooper, in the opening match on the centre court. So that was the most exciting match I played.
Was there a kind of raucous English crowd cheering you on as the well, you're partly Welsh, partly English, but if I could say the Englishman or the British player playing against, well, I guess he was world's number one at the time, Ashley Cooper.
Well, it's interesting because I think mostly these opening matches on the centre court are regarded almost as a formality. There's a top player and some unknown person has been by chance drawn against him for the first round, and so not sure if many people were all that interested in the match until I did quite well and won a set, and then they became quite excited and they were quite uh, full of applause when I won the odd point. So it was good.
Yes, of course. This was, tennis only became a kind of the open era in 1968. So it was a slightly different era, but still thrilling, and in fact, maybe more important because it wasn't all about money and sponsorship. It was really about sport and winning and good play and so on, and good sporting gestures, wasn't it, in those days?
Yes, it was. I mean, those were days. I was very lucky to be playing tennis at that era when amateur players like me, if they do reasonably well in other tournaments, had a possible chance of getting into Wimbledon. And nowadays, you have to be a full-time player and go all over the world and so on to achieve that.
And in fact, to move into your second very impressive career, journalism, I'm not sure had you been a professional player, as you say, playing, 7 days a week, practicing, and probably having to go and live in Florida or something. I'm not sure you would have been able to develop a career in journalism if it was today and you would have been a professional tennis player.
No, absolutely not. I think in those days when I was playing, it was possible to have a reasonably successful tennis playing career and have a full-time job. And nowadays that is completely impossible. And nowadays people, when they're aged 15 or 16, when I was beginning to make some headway in junior tournaments and so on, I could have, I suppose, in principle, devoted my whole life to tennis, but I didn't do that.
Well, I should also point out that when I heard that later, when you were the New York, America correspondent for the FT, and you took time off from finding a story to go and play at Flushing Meadows in the US Open, the US Championships, I mean, it would have been unheard of today for a foreign correspondent to also play in the US Open after writing a story about something completely different earlier in the day.
Yeah, well, those were very different amateur days.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, so you left Oxford. You did, I think, 2 years in the Air Force as part of your national service, though you weren't flying planes, right?
No, I wasn't. I was in. I had a degree from university, and I was put into the education branch of the Royal Air Force. And for some reason or other, I never quite understood why, I was instructed to teach recruits the principles of radar and radio, which I knew very little about.
Well, all sounds very interesting and important. Anyway, so then you joined the Financial Times, the world famous business newspaper that people around the world know also for the fact it's printed on pink paper and for its influence and so on. But how did you get a job at the FT? It's lots of people want to work in media and journalism, and it's quite tough to get a job.
Well, it was largely a matter of luck. When I was in the Air Force, I applied to various companies, ICI, Procter and Gamble, and so on, for who were looking for graduate recruits. I knew that the FT was also interested in such people, and it seemed like an interesting possibility. So I applied without much expectation of getting a job, since I had not been I hadn't done undergraduate journalism, or whatever. But the FT at that time, and I think perhaps still to some extent now, had a policy of hiring a few graduates each year, not necessarily with top first class degrees, but reasonable degrees, and in the expectation that they might become good journalists. So it was a bit of chance.
And I remember you worked with some people who are besides being fine journalists were quite well known, at least later on. I remember from my childhood, for example, I think you worked with or under Nigel Lawson right at the beginning of your career, who later became the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the finance minister under Margaret Thatcher, and Lawson helped transform Britain really under the Thatcher years as in charge of the economy. Was that right? What was he like to work with?
Yes, that's right. I joined the features department, writing short articles about business topics and so on. And Nigel Lawson was the features editor at the time. So I worked very closely with him for a year or two, and I learned a lot from him. He was a very constructive and helpful boss, and I had a high regard for him, as I continue to have a high regard for him as he made his way up the political career.
And you also worked with another well-known economist or economic journalist, Samuel Britton. Is that right?
Yes, he was the economic commentator at the FT and a very influential one. I think he played quite a big part in the kind of change of thinking about economic policy, how the economy should be run, and so on, which began to take hold in the 1970s and was, as it were, implemented by Margaret Thatcher and her colleagues. So he was a very important asset on the FT and an influence on government policy.
And William Rees-Mogg was another colleague at the FT in those
Yes,
days.
he was a little older than me, but not much. And he later on had all kinds of jobs, but he was well known as being editor of the Times newspaper.
Yeah. In fact, younger people watching this have probably heard of some of the children of these people, Nigella Lawson, the celebrity chef, the daughter of Nigel Lawson, or Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was a politician and is now a TV presenter, the son of William Rees-Mogg. But it's important to emphasize that Nigel Lawson and indeed William Rees-Mogg in many ways were far more important on a sort of serious political level than their children. And I sometimes wonder if people have heard of Nigel Lawson because Nigella is so famous, but Nigel Lawson was a very historic figure, really.
He was. He was an absolutely key figure in the Thatcher reforms.
Yes. And then you got a job as a foreign correspondent for the FT as their America correspondent, yeah?
Yes, I did. In 1961, I was appointed the US correspondent based in New York. I was, I think, only the second full-time FT correspondent in America. It was just when the FT was beginning to get more global, having more overseas offices and so on. So I was very, very lucky indeed to get that job.
And in fact, you covered two events that, are household. They're so well known. Even some young teenager today is aware of both of them, both in 1963, a few weeks apart. I remember you saying you covered Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights leader's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. That was the first of these world famous events. What was that like?
Yes, I mean that was a very extraordinary and memorable thing to have experienced. As you say, I was one of many, many thousands of people around the Lincoln Memorial on that day, and it was a hugely impressive and moving speech. And the reaction of the people around him was also very, very emotional. It was a day to remember.
Yes, I mean, even now, I think a lot of people, in fact, everyone should know lines from his remarks that day, such as his hope that Americans would one day be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And of course, the world has changed a lot since then, and America has changed with, for example, Barack Obama being voted twice American president. But in those days, it was just revolutionary for Martin Luther King to call for equality for African Americans, Black Americans, the same way, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean he was a great figure, and of course at that time, 1963, there were lots of battles that the civil rights movement still had to win. So it was very much in the middle of the civil rights struggle, and he was a very kind of charismatic and hugely impressive figure.
Yeah, and another important figure was JFK, President Kennedy, and he was tragically assassinated in November of that year, so about 2 or 3 months after Martin Luther King's speech. And even today, people say in movies, "Where were you? Or do you remember what you were doing when you heard that JFK was shot?" So, Jeff, what were you doing? And also, I think you covered the funeral, which was a very important occasion too.
Yes, I was in New York at the time of the assassination. I remember having lunch near the office, which is in the sort of lower west side of Manhattan. Came back to the office. Somebody shouted out, "Kennedy has been shot." We didn't know that he'd been killed. We watched the television for the next half an hour. And then Walter Cronkite, who was a very famous TV anchorman, commentator, came on and announced that Kennedy had died. Yes, not not easily forgotten.
And the funeral was held, I think, in only a couple of days later, and it was one of the world's at the time one of the world's biggest ever gatherings of world leaders. Actually, Kennedy's funeral. Do you recall that?
Very much so. I was in Washington at the time, and indeed spent most of my time in Washington during that period. A very moving occasion. I remember particularly the great crowd or group of world leaders walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, led by General de Gaulle. And I remember he was, for some reason, next to him was the Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia. No, it was a dignified and emotional occasion. And I remember a few days later, a particularly striking thing was Lyndon Johnson's speech to Congress shortly after he had assumed the presidency. And again, it was a calm, dignified, reassuring, well-crafted speech, which was just what the occasion demanded. I had a great admiration for Lyndon Johnson, partly for that, the way he handled the transition to the new presidency, even though later on his reputation came under attack. He was a fine man.
Interesting to hear that. Um, and you, anyway, so then you returned to London after 3 years in New York. And what was your role then at the FT?
I came back to the job of industrial editor. So I was relatively senior on the industrial side and covering a lot of big industrial stories and a lot of very important industrial leaders like Arnold Weinstock, Lord Weinstock of the General Electric Company, GEC, and Donald Stokes at British Leyland, and so on. So that probably gave me a kind of deeper insight into the way companies worked and the way industries worked than I'd had before.
And as I recall, when we've spoken about it before, you decided to take a couple of years out from journalism to try something different. And having covered industry, you thought you wanted to, just get an insights from the inside of actually working in connection with industry for 2 or 3 years. What were you doing then?
Yes, well, I was interested in seeing how companies worked from the inside rather than just reporting from the outside. And the government, which was a Labour government, was setting up a new agency called the Industrial Reorganisation Corporation, which was a kind of merger promoting agency trying to encourage companies to get bigger by taking over other companies. And they were hiring people not necessarily with lots of industrial experience, but younger people like me in their 30s, early 30s. And it seemed like an opportunity which I took. And I spent 2 very interesting years working for them.
And I think
And
you
then
also,
after that,
yes.
yes, after that, I thought I'd left journalism and I took a job with a thing called the British Leyland Motor Corporation, which was a large amalgamation of virtually all the British-owned car makers like Austin and Morris and Rover and Jaguar and so on. Very, very big company. And I worked there for 2 or 3 years.
Yes, I mean British Leyland, was it from an era where Britain had such a big car company, up there with the world, the big companies of the world. Also, I think they did Mini and Jaguar and a whole lot of how Triumph, a whole lot of household names. So then you went back to the FT because I think you were kind of earmarked to become deputy editor by the new editor, which is one reason you decided to return. Is that right?
Well, I didn't know I was going to be deputy editor, but I think that was what the um, person who was about to become editor had in mind. So I went back to do a normal writing job. I think my main assignment at that time was to write about European industry, and particularly British companies trying to establish themselves in on the continent. Although we had not yet become members of the European community. That seemed likely, as indeed did happen in 1973.
Yes, of course, the European community, later called the European Union. Everyone's familiar with the great Brexit debates of a few years ago, but there was also a pretty heated debate back in the mid 70s or early 70s about whether to join the European community in the first place. And it was like Britain moving away from its more sort of empire slash Commonwealth orientations to become more European, or so we thought at the time. So that must have been an interesting period as well for a journalist.
Yes, it was. And of course, the person who as it were, got Britain into the community was Edward Heath, who was the Prime Minister from 1970 to 1974. And I think that was a great achievement on his part. Some other aspects of his regime were not so successful, and he ended up in not in a very strong position and lost the election in 1974. But he was instrumental in getting us into the community, and of course played a part in the referendum which you mentioned in 1975.
And then after, was his name Freddie Fisher, the
Yes,
editor,
yes.
retired, and you, as deputy, took his place. And I think that pretty much you were editor throughout the 1980s, and that pretty much coincided with the era in which Margaret Thatcher was three times British Prime Minister and, in a way, transformed Britain, or certainly the British economy. Did you come across her much?
Yes, I became editor in 1980, which was not long after she'd come to Downing Street and remained there until the end of 1990, so about 10 years. And yes, we saw a lot of, I personally saw a lot of Margaret Thatcher. We had a regular annual interview with her in Downing Street. She came to lunch from time to time at the FT. So I got to know her and indeed admire her pretty well.
What was she like? Was she the Iron Lady that she's been depicted as?
Well, I think she was tough, very firm in her opinions, and but she relished argument and quite happy to respond to criticism and questions and so on. So yeah, she was a from an interviewer's perspective, she was uh, forthcoming, interesting, and always had something to say.
And very impressive in lots of ways. So you've dealt with Thatcher. You've also sort of been in the been around Kennedy and Johnson. In a way, we don't have today many leaders in the world as impressive as Thatcher. Even people who might not have agreed with all her policies would surely admit she was a very impressive individual. And I'm not sure political leaders today are quite as you know quite as what's the word accomplished or bold as her. I don't know.
Yes, I mean, I think this is not, he's still quite active, but I think Tony Blair was a major figure in British political history. He transformed, if Margaret Thatcher transformed the country, Tony Blair transformed the Labour Party and made a huge contribution. And rather strangely, one might think that contribution is now not much admired by people in the Labour Party.
Well, it is strange. I think both Thatcher and Blair were very impressive, and they were both very much disliked, perhaps because they've been successful. People resent them for various ways, but I, for one, admire of both of them. So anyway, you had in that period also you were in charge of the FT editor, is a period in which the FT itself also expanded internationally. I think you opened or started printing in Frankfurt. The Financial Times became a more international paper, not just a British paper.
Yes, I think it was both became a European newspaper and an international newspaper. I think Freddie Fisher, who was my predecessor as editor, who was a German-born person and had a very, very strong commitment to Europe, integrated Europe politically and economically integrated. So I think he was a important factor. But as you say, we started printing in Frankfurt, which made the paper available more easily to readers on the continent. The FT became quite an influential sort of must-read newspaper in Brussels at the European Commission. So that was very much part of the evolution of the paper during that period.
And also, Margaret Thatcher was obviously impressed by your editorship because she awarded you a knighthood. In the days, I might add, when it still was more prestigious than it sometimes is now, where they seem to dole them out all over the place. But in the days when you were awarded one, it was a very unique and distinguished thing to be awarded a knighthood. So after decades at the FT, you didn't want to retire and you turned your hands to academia and went to work and teach at the LSE, the London School of Economics. Yeah.
Yes, I thought that I knew I wasn't going to stay as editor for any longer than about 10 years. That's long enough in that sort of job, and I wanted to. I was interested in learning a bit more, in a bit more depth, how industries work, how companies work, international competition, technology, and all that. And that was the attraction of joining the London School of Economics, the Department of Management, and I taught students, undergraduate and graduate students, on business-related topics, corporate strategy, corporate governance, and those sort of issues. So I was very fortunate in being able to have, in effect, a second career as an academic, and I enjoyed my time there a lot.
Yeah, and you wrote a number of books which people can find on Amazon and elsewhere. And I think you're still writing books and you're still involved with, think tanks like Policy Exchange, one of Britain's leading think tanks, and still give talks now and again, yes?
Yes, I'm still interested, and obviously we've got a very confusing or complicated political situation in Britain, and so I follow all that quite closely. And as you say, I've written a few things for Policy Exchange and for the FT sometimes on issues where I have some experience.
And you're also able, because of the longevity of your career, to offer sort of insights as to how things were done better or worse in the past and how we might apply those lessons today.
Yes, I think I can provide a bit of as you say, a bit of an insight into, for example, into the Thatcher period, which remains quite controversial. With some people think that Thatcher did a lot of damage to industry, caused unemployment and so on. I think most of those accusations are unfair or at least greatly exaggerated. But I think because I was there and followed this story closely in the 1980s, I can provide a bit of perspective on that continuing argument.
I'm sure, Jeff, one thing about you is you're very modest. I'm sure you provide a great amount of perspective and policy exchange, and others are happy to have you. We are almost out of time, but I just wanted to thank you and suggest that people might also want to look at your books, read your articles, and so on, or a policy exchange website. And maybe we'll have another chat in a few years when you're approaching 100 to see your perspective on
I
that age.
absolutely. Thank you very much for
Okay.
asking.
And
Thank you
thank you
very
very
much.
much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.